Hello, and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I want to do the books to read in pairs, fiction and non-fiction pairing tag. So I believe the books to read in pairs tag was originally started by Jen Campbell, but I saw it over on a Book Olive's channel when she did her non-fiction November version of pairing up a fiction book with a non-fiction book that either go together, deal with similar topics, or in some way enhance when you read the two of them together. So I've picked 5 pairs of books that I want to talk about briefly today. And they're books that I either read in pairs when I read them, or they're books that I wish I'd read together because they do go together so well. So the first pair I'm going to talk about is actually a pair that I am reading right now, so I haven't actually finished these books. But one of them was on my nonfiction November TBR this year, and I had a fiction pairing that went so well that I decided I would read them together, and it was definitely a good idea. So those books are Elizabeth's Rival by Nicola Tallis and The Virgin's Lover by Philippa Gregory. So the reason these two books go together so well is that they're both set during the Tudor era, and this book, The Virgin's Lover, is dealing with kind of the beginning of Elizabeth I's reign, and is partially told from the point of view of Amy Dudley, Robert Dudley's first wife, and it kind of goes into her perspective on the involvement between him and Elizabeth and to what extent they were involved. And then this book, Elizabeth's Rival, is dealing with Robert Dudley's second wife, Letitia Knollys. So you've got the first wife and the second wife, so definitely read The Virgin's Lover first, because if you don't know how Amy's story ends, there are spoilers for that obviously in Elizabeth's Rival, but it's just really interesting to read the two of them together to get kind of a more in-depth and historically accurate perspective from this book, and then to get some of the feelings and emotions behind what was going on in this book. So I would definitely recommend reading those two together. Then the next set I have to recommend are also 2 books that I've read this year, and that is The Five, The Untold Stories of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Haley Rubenhold, and The Odd Women by George Gissing. So The Five is a historical nonfiction book, and it's dealing with the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. It's one of my favorite, definitely one of my favorite nonfiction reads of this year, possibly of all time. It basically just goes through and gives you a profile, a biography of each of the women who lost their lives at the hands of Jack the Ripper. And it basically goes through their lives and explains how they ended up being in a vulnerable position where he was able to take advantage of them. So you go through each woman's story. It's very sad. A lot of them had issues with addiction, issues of poverty, spousal abuse, domestic violence, and then just failure of the social safety net at the time to support people who needed it. But it goes through and it's very well researched. You can tell that the authors put a lot of effort into uncovering little facts about their lives, and especially about the lead up to their death. So she's gone back into the historical records and really built a profile of who these women were as people. And then The Odd Women by George Gissing is a Victorian novel, so it was written roughly in the same time period as Jack the Ripper's attacks, and it's really looking at the role of women in Victorian society at the time, and particularly women that didn't necessarily fit into the traditional mold of wife and mother. So we have some spinsters, we have some women that are trying to run their own school for women, we have women that have to work to make ends meet, and there were definitely a few of the characters in The Odd Women that I saw kind of mirroring some of the tragic arcs of the women from The Five. So The Odd Women is also dealing with important social topics like addiction and domestic violence, and for something that was written in the Victoria era, it is dealing with it in quite a modern feminist way, and I really could make the connection between the women's stories that I had learned about in The Five, and then seeing how a lot of these characters could have ended up in a similar situation. So I would definitely recommend reading those two together. I think reading The Five first and then reading The Odd Women would really enhance your reading experience of both. Then the next pair is actually a pair that I read this year for Victober, and that is The Englishwoman in Egypt by Sophia Lane Poole, and the Amelia Peabody series by Elizabeth Peters, particularly the first book, The Crocodile on the Sandbank. So both of these books deal with English women in Egypt during the Victorian era. So An Englishwoman in Egypt is a series of letters written by Sophia Lane Poole, who had gone to live with her brother, who was an Egyptologist and archaeologist at the time. And she was going through somewhat of a messy separation from her husband, and her brother invited her to come stay with him in Egypt for a while, hoping that she would also have access to parts of Egyptian society that were close to him as a man. Just in general, what was the life experience of Egyptian women? So she wrote a series of letters back to a magazine to be published about her time in Egypt, what she saw, what she observed, what it was like to live there. She talks about going and exploring the pyramids. And then The Crocodile and the Sandbank, we've got Amelia Peabody, who's arrived in Egypt. She's interested in archaeology. She goes through some very similar experiences as Sophia Lane Poole does in visiting the pyramids, in taking a boat down the Nile. And this is a cozy mystery series set in Egypt, so at the same time she is working to solve a mystery, and there's a little side plot of romance. For that pair, I don't know if I would really say that there was a reading order that particularly mattered, although I read The Englishwoman in Egypt first and then read the mystery series, and I think that worked well because The Englishwoman in Egypt is a little bit dry, so it was kind of an incentive to keep carrying through with that, knowing that I had the mystery to look forward to. Then the fourth pairing is technically actually two nonfiction books, and that is Freedom Libraries by Mike Selby and the March graphic novel series by John Lewis. So this is a book that actually came onto my radar because my library did a region-wide book club with it, and we had a Zoom call with the author, who's also local to our region. And this is talking about libraries that were set up in the American South during the Freedom Summer for African Americans. So these were communities that previously didn't have access to any books, and people were working really hard trying to get libraries set up that Black Americans could have access to, that they would have books in them that represented their experiences, and they would help improve literacy rates in the population to help prevent voter suppression. So the cover actually shows that they had, for some of these libraries, the communities they were in, they faced such a backlash from white people living in the areas that they had to guard the libraries at night with armed guards. So that was pretty sobering to realize that there was people, this is in the 60s, people in America were bombing libraries and didn't want people to have access to this book. It's a pretty short, accessible read. The author has gone to a lot of effort to find a lot of first-person accounts, so it's a really interesting read. And then the March graphic novel series is a nonfiction account of the author's experience being involved in the civil rights movement. Because it's written in a graphic novel format, it's very accessible and easier to read and digest than I think it would be in other formats, and it really brings the story to life because you have that visual element to what he's talking about. The first book in particular I found absolutely incredible, and I think would pair really well with Freedom Libraries. So I highly recommend reading those ones together as well. Then the last pairing I have to share today is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens and Rag and Bone, A Family History of What We've Thrown Away by Lisa Willett. And the reason why I think these two books would go so well together is that in Our Mutual Friend, the kind of main plot revolves around a man who's made his money in dust, and after he passes away, then the plot ensues from there about who's set to inherit his money, what conditions do they need to meet. And his son, who's supposed to be inheriting his father's estate, is murdered, and so we have that mystery to solve, and then the people and the estate passes on to his trusted servants, who come into wealth that they had never expected. And there's a whole host of side characters who are involved in this story in some way, and that theme of trash being treasure kind of weaves throughout the novel. And the dust heaps are a fairly essential plot point, I would say, of the book, and it was something at the time when I was reading it that I thought was exaggerated by Dickens, because he's known to exaggerate things and kind of, I guess, blow things out of proportion a bit, or personify people and objects in a strange way. So when he talked about these mountains and mountains of dust in the backyard of this man's estate, I thought that was somewhat hyperbolic. But then when I was reading Rag and Bone by Lisa Willett, she talks about how people made fortunes off of dust, and there's actually a direct reference to our mutual friend in this book, and she goes into the real life story of the man who inspired Dickens to write that book. So currently reading Rag and Bone illuminated my reading of Our Mutual Friend, and in this book she's going through what can be learned from collecting remnants of garbage, basically. So she does mudlarking in the Thames in London, as well as some beachcombing, and talks about the different things she has found in the Thames River and on the coast of the UK, and describe how these items illuminate aspects of the culture and the time period that they are from. So she mentions really interesting things like, as literacy rates rise, at the same time you see more and more ink bottles being disposed of, which, yeah, of course, but I wouldn't have thought of that. And she does have some really great descriptions about what garbage collection practices were in the Victorian era in London, and the dust heaps in particular. So highly recommend reading Rag and Bone together with Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. So those are the 5 fiction non-fiction pairings that I have that I think go really well together. And if any of these books are on your TBR, I would highly recommend picking up their pairing and reading them together, because each of these books has enriched my reading experience of the other. So I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.